Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. So glad you could join me today, and that I can join you. You're allowing me into your homes, your places of work, wherever you're listening to or watching the Lunch Hour. We greatly appreciate it. And in fact, please, I'll say this again at the end. If you're listening to us on one of the fine podcast platforms that is out there, like us, leave us a review, subscribe to us. That certainly helps. And if you are listening and you want to watch us, you can watch us on YouTube, and vice versa. If you're watching us on YouTube, check us out on one of those fine podcast platforms. Tell your friends, tell your family members, tell your friends' family members. As I said, I'm Andrew Langer, very excited for our guest to be joining us today. Her name is Elizabeth Nickson. She's a multifaceted individual with an impressive career spanning several different fields. She worked her way through college and graduate school, contributing significantly to the arts by starting and running theater companies, including Canada's first professional feminist theater company. Her career took a dynamic turn when she moved to New York in 1980, where she worked for a Broadway producer and renowned film director Arthur Penn. Going to have to ask her about that. Following her time in New York, Elizabeth relocated to London, working as a stringer for Time magazine and eventually becoming the European bureau chief of Life magazine. During her tenure, she conducted high-profile interviews and managed significant journalistic projects covering the First Gulf War and Nelson Mandela's release. She's also an accomplished book author in her own right, with her novel, The Monkey Puzzle Tree, exploring the CIA's mind control programs. This book, along with her various writings for prestigious publications like The Guardian, Vogue, and Harper's Magazine, showcases her diverse literary talents. Her article, Where the Bee Sucks, was notably included in the Best American Travel Writing of 2002. Returning to Canada in 1998, Elizabeth continued her writing career as a contributor and columnist for major newspapers. Her unique approach to economics, politics, and culture gained her widespread recognition, leading to appearances on radio and television, as well as engagements in debates and speeches. In 2012, she published Eco-fascists, a critical examination of conservationism and its impact on rural communities, a subject near and dear to my heart. Elizabeth's journey is a testament to her versatility and influence across different spheres, from the arts to journalism and literature. Elizabeth Nickson, thank you so very much for joining us today. Welcome to the Lunch Hour.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
So let's start here, because it seems, and I would suspect you might say that your politics really haven't changed, but you founded the first feminist theater company in Canada, before 1980. 2012, you write a book on eco-fascism. Was there a journey that was involved there? Or do you think your politics changed, or do you think the world changed around you? How do you account for that?
No, I think my politics changed, although when I was a feminist, it was more about opening professions for women rather than the terrible mess it is now.
Yeah.
But my mother nagged me into getting an MBA, so I kind of figured out how capitalism works and became very enthusiastic about it. Also, I come from a family that's been in the States and Canada for 400 years.
Wow.
And they were all businessmen and women in small towns and small cities across both countries. And the left sees these people as bad or evil, or, and so when I would listen to them, and I had many communist friends, I would think, but this is actually not true.
Sure.
Because that family was, while successful financially, they were charitable monsters. I mean, in every city and town that they lived in, they built all the charitable institutions. And, I'm talking early on in the early 1800s, the 1700s, schools, churches, hospitals. I mean, right up until the 1950s, they were people like them. Ordinary people working in the private market were the power in all their communities. Yeah. My great-grandmother founded the Vancouver General Hospital in a tent with
Wow.
her other friends from church. And it's now a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that spreads throughout the city and treats millions and millions of people. It wasn't government that did that. It was, all the men and women that the left hates who managed to build what we now live on. So that's what changed me.
Let's talk about this disdain that the left has, especially for people in rural communities, and the amount of influence. I want to get into the subject of natural asset companies in a few minutes, but I want to focus on your 2012 book, Eco-Fascists. And let's talk about the progressive approach to environmental policy and how it goes and devastates communities. You and I guess, chewed up some of the same scenery in the late 90s and into the 2000s. I worked on some issues having to do with the Pacific Northwest and timber companies. That's a lot of folks know this, but it's not just like the timber companies, not even just rural America, but you look at the Rust Belt in America and the devastation that was there. And this idea, I think it was Barack Obama who famously said that these people can learn to code. Why is there such a disdain? But most importantly, how does it manifest itself? And how do you talk about this in your book, Eco-Fascists? There's a lot there.
Yeah, there is a lot there. I think they feel disdain for those people because they're in the way.
Yeah.
And they want them to get out of the way, and they want to take over. Where I live, it's very, very green, and we have a lot of people who have never really done anything in their lives but work for government or consult for government, who think they know how to run a community. Well, our community is aging. It's dying.
Sure.
An average house costs $1 million because the development is so restricted and there's so many rules. So they're basically trying to kill us off so they can take over. I'm not pulling punches anymore on this.
Don't.
I used to be sort of, okay, well, we'll be softly, but I don't. I see them as broadly destructive and genocidal.
Literally had a conversation today with a college student in which I talked about the 1990s book by then the youngest president of the Sierra Club, Adam Werbach, called Act Now, Apologize Later. Yeah. That's the sentiment that you're talking about. It is this action that we're going to take where we don't care what happens. We don't care who it impacts. And if we need to apologize, they probably don't think that they do. But if they need to apologize, they'll apologize later. That's what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, I am. What happened up here, you probably know, we had the largest industrial forest in the world in British Columbia. And in the late 80s and through the 90s, they based the environmental movement shut it down.
Yeah.
And, RFK Jr. was behind a lot of that. So I'm kind of unforgiving about that. So what happened when they shut down our forests? The forest was paying for all our health care, which we have universal health care up here, so government pays for it. So it was paying for all our education and all our health care. And what happened was they said, well, it's a beautiful place. All those loggers can become tourist service people.
Yeah.
And that doesn't feed a family. Doesn't come close to feeding a family. So what happened up here was that we've always had a large Asian contingent here. But what happened was all the Asian cartels moved in. And now our principal source of revenue, tax revenue, is cartel money. Wow. We launder most of the drug money in North America through our casinos and Vancouver real estate.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the effect of the environmental movement.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about this because, and sorry if I go off on a bit of a tangent here, Elizabeth, but it's you started off by talking about the issue of early feminism. And early feminism, I think you didn't say it, but I'm going to put words in your mouth, about empowerment and people empowered to do for themselves and act in their own betterment. And yet there seems to be a movement on the part of the left to make people essentially vassals or serfs. I mean, Hayek talks about the road to serfdom, but this kind of serf mentality. Well, you can't do for yourself in the timber industry, we want you to become a vassal to the wealthy and show them how to enjoy this environment there.
Yes.
Or, as you're saying
Yes.
now, we want to create this way to launder money for Asian cartels. That's really right. It again, there's the devastation in its wake. Ecofascism, that the book does not just talk about the Pacific Northwest. It talks about other areas, or is it just really
Yeah.
focused on the Pacific Northwest?
I traveled mostly through the American West down to Texas and as far west. Well, I mean, I was in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Washington State, Oregon, and California, New Mexico, and Texas. So I reported on. I took case studies like the Harvard Business School and showed what was happening, what the environmental movement had done in each state, and how it had crippled it. Basically, that's what they do. They cripple. And I used also Upper New York State as a case study because they've just destroyed that. The Adirondacks. I mean, they've destroyed it, and they've destroyed Upper New York State. It could be a huge engine of prosperity, and it has been shut down.
So let's now sort of circle into where we are today. Actually, before we get there, so I also had a conversation while I was on my way into the studio with my colleague here at the Federal Newswire in the podcast world, Jerry Rogers, who's also the editor of Real Clear Policy, and we were talking about this, and he and I have both been around the conservatarian side of environmental policy for the last 3 decades.
Nice.
And thank you. And we were talking about folks who've sort of transitioned into sort of being more quasi-environmental, who are sort of giving into the environmental side of things. But this is not where I want to go. The issue of broad-based environmental policies like net zero, like ESG. One of the things that he and I were talking about the why, and I said, well, some of it has to do with folks who want to engage in control, right? When you have a huge regulatory state, you're controlling individual behavior. Yeah. And the other part of this is the massive fleecing of the economy. Folks who want to take out vast sums of money out of the public fisc and put it into their own pocket, or redistribute it so that people become dependent upon it in the general public. Do I have that right? I mean, as a precursor to talking about the natural asset companies, do I at least have that relationship right?
Yeah, that's exactly what's happened. Yeah. I think that what's happened with the environmental movement is that it's been taken over by massive interests, multinationals, foundations working for their masters, the corporation. So I'm going to give you an example here.
Please.
I have a really good friend who has 2 family foundations, one in the UK and one in the US, in Canada. And she runs them both. She was educated to it. It's a family-held food corporation. She funds the Nature Conservancy of Canada up in the millions every year.
Wow.
And she says she has to, because otherwise they will attack her relentlessly. So the entire movement will go for her. So it's kind of become this symbiotic, it is sick. It's not a good symbiosis. It's an evil symbiosis. They're eating at each other. So I think that corporate interests, because they're very smart, have decided just to co-opt the environmental industry. I mean, it's not a movement anymore. It's a business. It's a big business.
Well,
and
time out for a second. I mean, because let's talk about that with regards to the Nature Conservancy, right? Because the Nature Conservancy is a property, a land business.
Yeah.
They couch themselves in being nonprofit, but what they do is they target land that they want.
Yeah.
They threaten it, or they get somebody to threaten that land with condemnation, with a taking under the Fifth Amendment. The United States is how they do this. The property loses all value. The owner of that property can't sell it. And then the Nature Conservancy swoops in and buys it for a song. And then as they're putting together other plots, they can trade things out and make, right? I mean, do I have that correct? Yeah,
That's
please.
exactly right. And they have
Yeah.
$6 billion worth of land on their books as
Amazing.
an asset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. And they've used the money of innocents who've given them $25 or $2,000, and they've got money from every single level of government and from every business and I think they're evil.
It's certainly, when you think about, you can look at what happened in Virginia with there are a couple of different cases in Virginia. We talk about out near the Piedmont. I mean, it's always, there's always a negative that's involved here. So it used to be, right? So in the 90s, I mean, obviously folks were starting to talk about, climate change in the 80s and into the 90s.
Yeah.
They were calling it global warming. At one time they were calling it global cooling. But at the same time, they're talking about, wetlands. They're talking about endangered species as ways of gathering up the Endangered Species Act, of gathering up land. We spent a lot of time here on the lunch hour talking about those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But now we have, it seems to have been completely weaponized. Now we have ESG. Now we have net zero. Talk about how they've now infiltrated, or have they really infiltrated corporate America, or has corporate America realized that they can make a buck on this? Talk about that.
Well, I think that both ESG and net zero have several purposes, and one of them is to shutter small business.
Right.
Because they can't measure up, and therefore the multinational gets all the business. So any, tool and die or widget operator in northern Vancouver Island is just shut out, and some big guy comes in and they order everything from Amazon from now on. Right. So that's part of ESG and net zero. It allows for the shuttering of the small operator and the gutting of every rural area in the world, because without these businesses, those towns and counties won't exist, which fits in with the net zero. It clears people off the land and pushes them into cities where they can be controlled and live in little matchboxes. I have a friend who's building 4 high rises in the nearby capital city because we're desperately short of housing here. He says that green building regulations add $1,000 a month in rent to a 1-bedroom apartment.
Wow.
And not only that, he says, I have to build low ceilings, small windows. I can't afford to do anything else. What they've done is they've actually destroyed building.
Yeah.
They've destroyed it. You can't build a house anymore. I've built 2 houses in my life. I built my first house, and then I built this ultra green house that I'm living in now. If I tried to do this now, it cost me like $3 million.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And it's
for 2,300 square feet.
Wow. They want to get you in cities, as you said, into these matchbox apartments.
Yeah.
They want to get you out of your car. They want to get you on mass transit, on their schedule, going where they allow you to go, when they allow you to go there. If you are lucky enough to afford a green car, an electric car that takes however many hours to charge, that'll go a certain distance. In America, we now have this legislation. This is going to sound like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. The legislation that's going to put a kill switch in your car. This is really is about, and you wrote a book. I'm sorry. Let's tie this in with your book on mind control issues. I mean, that was a piece of fiction, but were you seeing trends even then? Could you have even envisioned this, Elizabeth Nickson?
No, because when I did the PR for that book, I said, this was all shut with such confidence.
Yes.
This was all shut down by the church committee in the early 70s. They promised they weren't going to do any more mind control experiments.
Sure.
Well, of course, that was a complete lie. And they've refined it so that we have no idea what they're doing to us now. What we do know is that a fire hose of propaganda greets us every morning when we wake up from every conceivable medium. So, the environmental movement has mastered propaganda so that every innocent in the world thinks that, that the air is going to boil and we're losing all our species, and it's nonsense.
Right. At the same time, the solutions that they're proposing either don't work in any kind of physical science based reality, right? You can't attack the
No.
chemistry industry in America and expect the automotive industry to develop light, strong cars. But then at the same time, you're also talking about technologies that are serving to have hugely devastating environmental consequences,
Yes.
whether it's mining for rare earth minerals in Africa or in China using slave labor, or scraping the bottom of the ocean and interrupting their ability to process carbon in the atmosphere, if that's indeed a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, I didn't. I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I think their science is I think their science is wrong.
Yeah.
I think from when I researched endangered species, it seems as if all of their math is wrong.
Right.
So that when it's litigated properly, an endangered species transgression, they always find for the property owner because the science that they use is errant. It like the little spotted owl. That was
Oh,
all
yes.
nonsense. So here they tried to put in a tree cutting permitting process. I have like 20,000 trees on my property.
Sure.
There's like 1 million trees on this island, and they want us to apply for a permit to cut one.
Right.
And they tried to use the coastal Douglas fir being an endangered species. Now, the coastal Douglas fir runs from Northern California all the way up to Alaska, and they tried to claim it was endangered. Well, I mean, all you have to do is go onto Wikipedia, and they got very, very far with that until somebody noticed that, in fact, that it. So that's how actually dishonest and unethical and wrong these people are. In every single area that you look into, their science is wrong.
Let's get into the topic that I really want to talk to you about. Now, you and I haven't spoken before. So my background, I do the media work that I do here, I do radio, but I also am deeply involved in regulatory policy. It's a great passion of mine, especially environmental and energy and natural resources policy.
Good.
The very first job that I had was working for a blind environmental attorney who was a guest here on the lunch hour, a guy named Roger Marzullo. And one of the things that has bothered me is when I don't learn about a regulatory proceeding until it's too late. And back in October here in the States, we had a regulatory proceeding on something called natural asset companies, which I didn't hear about until a week after the rulemaking was done. When I read about it, I couldn't believe what we're doing here. And I was kicking myself that I didn't get involved in it. Tell us all what natural asset companies are and the real danger that's involved here.
Well, it seems an almost preposterous thing that anybody would ever think it up. And
I was flabbergasted by it.
Try to institute it. It means in its sort of most crude forms that America is going to sell its national parks to hedge funds to manage. Is it that's right? I mean, every wildlife refuge, every ecological study zone, every state and locally held protected land is available for sale.
Now, it's interesting because when I had talked about, years ago, when I was in graduate school, I'd written a paper about corporate sponsorships in national parks, for things like beautification, right? By the time when film cameras were still a thing, because that's how old I am, get Kodak to sponsor a Vista and give money to Yosemite National Park or the National Park Service to help, clean things up. That's what I had been thinking about. Yeah. But what we're talking about here, and let me make sure I understand this correctly. So you have this movement, under the guise of net zero and a couple of other plans. They've wanted to create this national plan on carbon and carbon emissions. They can't get a carbon tax through. There are folks who are calling for this. Carbon trading hasn't really worked. That was the Enron approach to sort of dealing with the anthropomorphic portions of so-called climate change. So now the latest is to allow hedge funds to buy rights in these parks, and the park the success now and the pristine nature of the parks, they buy the rights to that, and they could trade those, and people give them money as carbon credits. I mean, am I understanding that correctly? This is where I get fuzzy here.
It's tax deductions.
Got it.
They're buying.
So and things that are tradable. So literally, when we talk about this is the thing that gets me. It's these massive hedge funds that the Democrats. I'm sorry, I don't want to make this partisan. That progressives and others, and I certainly listen as a conservative. I am deeply, deeply troubled by crony capitalism and cronyism, and a hearty relationship between the government and major corporations. And there are folks on the progressive left who have also talked about this. But yet there is this situation that the Biden administration is putting forth. It's already closed for comment, that is literally selling the rights in these national treasures to these hedge funds. How is that possibly legal?
Well, I think they're going to give us all a carbon allowance, aren't they?
Yeah.
So you can buy more life, as it were, by it just seems so crazy.
Right.
It seems so crazy. But I guess, say, ABC hedge fund owns Yosemite, and
Right.
Yosemite is said to absorb so many tons of carbon per year.
Right.
So somebody can apply to the hedge fund for the ecosystem rights to a ton of carbon.
Right.
And then they can fly more. They can build something. They're trying to trade air. That's what it is. They're trying to trade air.
Which, by the way, is the plot line from Mel Brooks's Spaceballs, as I recall. And it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic and disturbing, because what you're really talking about here is something that I've talked about, Jerry's talked about, and others have talked about, which is this idea that the rich don't care about the cost of regulation because they'll always pay it. They have the wherewithal. They have the resources to pay it.
Yeah.
So you're right. What you're saying is, and this gets into the idea behind the social crediting system that some folks on the left want to implement, this idea that you have privileges in society based upon your social crediting system. Or, I'm sorry, it's like a video game in which you go and you can buy, better weapons or a better ship or more guns for your cowboy or a better horse or whatever.
Yeah.
And then dominate the game because you have more resources to do that. I mean, we talk about this idea of living in an egalitarian world where everybody is born with the same inalienable rights. Well, now you're talking about being able to buy more rights, the freedom of movement, the freedom to live. This is really disturbing stuff, isn't it?
It is. And water use, don't forget.
Yep. Oh, yes, absolutely.
Water is a huge, huge thing for control issues. So I would guess that we're going to have a water allowance at some point, because when I was doing Eco-fascists, an undercurrent in every single state was water rights, and they were always trying to grab back water rights and meter all the water so that we will be given water rights, and somebody can buy the permission to use more water. This
is something, it's so funny. Where I live in Virginia, there's a discussion about the aquifer and aquifer management, and certainly issues having to do with that. And of course, right, it gets exacerbated the more people you move out of rural America into the suburbs and into the cities. There's greater infrastructure. That infrastructure is expensive, so you can charge people more. I mean, okay.
The problem,
sorry, go ahead.
The problem with the with moving people into the cities is that, and it's staggering that they haven't figured this out, but when land is left to itself, it desertifies.
Yeah.
What happens in the forests of the Pacific Northwest is when they are overgrown, they suck up all the water. So water doesn't go downstream. It doesn't drop into the aquifers. It doesn't flow into the rivers. So we're just basically...
So I'm sorry, Elizabeth, let me interrupt you here. So when they are talking about climate change being responsible for increased droughts, what you're saying is that as we have shut off our forests from being harvested, that's something I need to talk to some folks about this, because I actually hadn't put that connection together, but it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. If you anywhere that you go in the States and you put a ranch or a farm beside a protected area, you can actually tell that what's which is which, and it's always that the ranch and the farm is healthier, and the
Right.
protected area has gone to invasive weeds. The invasive weeds desiccate the soil. They kill everything. They become a tinderbox. It's the protected areas that catch fire first. And because there are no fire breaks anywhere anymore, because they have this contiguous ecosystem belts through the country that you've seen those maps, I'm
Oh, yeah.
sure,
Absolutely.
Yellowstone to the
Sure.
Yukon, and so you don't have any. And I have my parents' friend, he ran Crown Zellerback, which was
Wow.
a huge forestry company out here, and he told me once, we would drag things out of the creek. We would burn brush. We'd pull out the stumps. We'd replant. Not anymore. We have
Right.
to leave everything. We clog up the creeks. The stumps stay in the ground. We don't replant. It all turns into a tangled brush. We walk away, and we've stopped managing our forests.
Right.
We just
Right.
stopped it.
It gets into the issue of the tragedy of the commons,
Yeah.
and that work, the work of Garrett Hardin and others,
Yeah.
and certainly the work, in the modern times of the Center for Private Conservation at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which spent years studying these things. Listen, I want to turn to happier topics, because I know your time is incredibly valuable, very, very generous with your time. I got to go back in your bio here, working with the celebrated director Arthur Penn. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you did with him and that impression on your life?
Well, Arthur was lovely. He really wanted an assistant that would keep the world away from him.
Okay.
So he had this office across from Lincoln Center in New York. It was
Sure.
very nice, and I was the only person that was ever there. And occasionally he would come down from Stockbridge and have a meeting with Warren Beatty, or I met all the sort of great
Oh, wow.
masters of Hollywood during that time, because they all came to ask him to direct their movies,
Sure.
and he would say no over and over and over again. He said all he wanted to do was ride his tractor around up in Stockbridge.
Sure.
But he was very gentle, and I took the job because I wanted to learn how to write. I wanted to teach myself to write, and that would give me the time to do that. And he has had some illustrious assistants who would go on to do better things than answering his phone.
Well, but writing great books, like
Better
the
than
ones
me.
you've written. But and let's talk about that. You have a Substack. Do you still have do you have two? Do you have one? Talk about your other writing that you do. How can folks find out more about the work that you're doing?
Okay, my Substack's called Welcome to Absurdistan.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's basically all I do right now, because I think it's politically so electric right now. I did Eco-Fascists with Adam Bello, who is
Yep.
now at Post Hill Press, and he's asked me to do a couple books, but it's just the world is too fraught and too interesting right now to spend another year researching policy, and you know what
Oh,
that
yeah.
work is like, and the Substack is very popular. I'm growing really, really fast,
Nice.
and I'm making money at it, and I'm you meet through things like that thousands of people, and
Yeah.
they're all so interesting. So right now I'm fascinated by the disclosure of alien life forms and alien tech. I think that could be explosive if they have reverse engineered this what they seem to have. It could mean a revolution. If they have 0 point energy, which I suspect they have or are very close to, that gets rid of global warming. It gets rid of every issue that we have in the environment, basically, and it eliminates poverty. So I'm very excited about that. I know that there are people fighting for disclosure, and I know people are fighting against it. But I think it's going to be the force of it is going to overwhelm the resistance. I'm interested in the Schumer amendment in front of Congress right now because the suspicion is that the aerospace companies have been capturing this tech, and Chuck Schumer has introduced an amendment saying that if this is the case, it belongs to the people, not aerospace companies, which is an interesting debate to have. But I hope that passes. To be nonpartisan here.
Sure, and I listen. I suspect that if somebody feels that they are going to be prevented from making a buck or having a monopoly over an entire industry, that will keep it from getting done. But that's the political cynic in me.
Yeah, I guess that's true, but I don't think that they can hold it back much longer. I think the economic boom that would come from that it just cancels everything, really. I'm not a fantasist, Andrew.
No.
I'm not, and I'm not. I know there's a lot of paranoia out there, and you have to sort through enormous amounts of guff to get to anything real. But
as you and I have been talking about today, right, Elizabeth, just because you might be paranoid doesn't mean that they're not after you. I mean, right, we've been talking about things that would be like fantabulous conspiracy theorizing if it wasn't true. So, but that's why you call it Welcome to Absurdistan, because there is so much absurdity out there, isn't it?
Yes, it's an expression from behind the Iron Curtain. That's what they used to call their countries in before the wall came down. Yeah.
As a former Soviet studies major, I recognize that. So listen, before I let you go, because one of the things I like to do is to ask my guests about their outside interests. I was at one point going to do a podcast focused entirely on the outside interests of people in the policy world. When you're not writing, what are you doing for fun?
We're just sort of happy.
Yeah. Well, you live in a beautiful part of the world,
we love our house. We love our forest. I cold ocean swim for fun.
Oh, wow.
And we have some nice mountains on the island, and so I climb those in all kinds of weather.
Oh, excellent.
So we have the usual complement of friends and family. It's not an exciting life, but it's a very happy life.
No, that's the important thing is to find your bliss where you can find it.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, Andrew. It's so great to meet somebody else who knows a lot about what's been going on.
Well, we do try, and I always love talking about these topics with somebody. Listen, my guest has been Elizabeth Nickson. She is the author at the Substack Welcome to Absurdistan, the author of a number of different wonderful books. Go and check those out. Go and check out her Substack. I am, as always, Andrew Langer. This has been the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. And as I say, please, if you're listening to us on the fine podcast platforms, subscribe, leave us a review, let your friends know, let your family members know. And if you are listening, you might want to go check us out on YouTube. If you're watching us, go and check out those things. Take care, have a great week, and please enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.